Hey guys, tonight, we slip quietly into a world of cold stone walls and creaking floorboards, where the fire barely warms the room, and the only thing simmering on the hearth is a pot of watery gruel. The Middle Ages. The kitchen is dim, lit only by the orange glow of a dying fire and a single tallow candle sputtering on the table. A woman stirs the pot slowly, rhythmically, like she's done every night of her life. The children huddle close by, their cheeks hollow, their eyes hopeful, though they already know what's for dinner. A crust of bread so dense and dry it must be dunked in broth to be chewable. And a thin, bitter porridge, barely more than boiled barley and cabbage. No salt, no meat, no color, just warmth. And the vague promise of not going to bed hungry. You can almost smell it. Not delicious, but earthy. A scent of boiled greens and damp wood. And behind it, something else animal. A pig rooting in the corner of the room, sharing the space like a family member. His grunts blend with the sound of the wind outside, slipping through the cracks in the walls like a reminder that winter is never far. This was not an uncommon sight in medieval Europe. For the vast majority of people, peasants, laborers, the forgotten bulk of history, this was dinner. Not a treat, not a feast, but a routine. And one that repeated day after day, season after season, year after year. But how did it get this way? Why was food in the Middle Ages so terrible? Why was it so bland, so monotonous, and often so dangerous? Tonight, we'll take a slow walk through the kitchens of history. We'll trace the reasons behind the daily struggle to eat. From the scarcity of spices, to the tricks of dishonest bakers, to the church's demands for fasting, to the filth that turned every bite into a gamble. But don't worry, this isn't a lecture. It's a gentle unraveling, a quiet stroll through time, designed to lull you to sleep while you learn how medieval folks managed to survive with barely enough on their plates. You'll meet an alewife who waters down her brew to feed her children, a nobleman whose feast hides a deadly secret, a monk stirring soup for strangers on the coldest day of the year. And through it all, we'll follow the same question. What was it like to eat? Not just survive, but eat, when the odds were stacked against you. Now, if you're still with me, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how many of us gather here, different places, different lives, but sharing this moment together. Leave a comment if you feel like it. I read every one. Now, take a deep breath and let the tension in your shoulders drift away, like the steam from a long-forgotten pot of pottage. And as we begin this journey through medieval hunger, scarcity, and the strange creativity of survival, let's go back, slowly, softly, to a world where food was not joy, but necessity. A world where sleep was a blessing, and hunger was a threat you felt in your bones. Imagine sitting down to a meal, and finding that everything tastes the same. No heat, no depth, no warmth of cinnamon, no spark of pepper on the tongue. Just bitterness. Salt if you're lucky. Vinegar if you're clever. Mustard seeds if you manage to keep any from the last market day. For most peasants in the Middle Ages, spices were not just rare, they were mythical. Pepper came from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, nutmeg from the Banda Islands where wars would one day be fought just for the trees, but in the cold kitchen of a village woman named Annis. Those spices might as well have come from the moon. She stirred her pot with the same old wooden spoon. Barley, turnips, leeks, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of wild garlic. It smelled earthy, honest, but not exciting. Because food wasn't about pleasure. It was about survival. There were no spice racks, no recipes, just tradition, muscle memory, and whatever the garden or forest offered that day. Even salt, the most basic seasoning, was precious. Carried inland from coastal towns or mined from rock. Sometimes traded, sometimes hoarded. And on days when there was no salt, food tasted like nothing. A grayness that filled the mouth and faded just as quickly. For the wealthy, of course, flavor was everywhere. They paid handsomely for sacks of saffron and boxes of clove. Their kitchens simmered with sauces spiked with exotic ingredients. Their feasts were both indulgence and performance. But outside the manor walls, the only flavor was hunger, the kind that sharpens every dull taste, that makes sour broth feel like a blessing, and bitter roots like a second chance. Most peasant families learned to stretch what little they had, to dry herbs in summer, to ferment vegetables in barrels, to boil everything long enough to soften the texture if not the taste. Because when you have no spices, you lean on time. Time to stew, time to wait, time to forget what food used to taste like, if it ever tasted like anything at all. And still, people shared. They passed the bowl. They offered the last crust. They taught their children to say thank you. Even for something as plain as boiled cabbage. It wasn't joyful, but it was life. And that, in its own quiet way, was enough. Let's step outside the smoky kitchen now, into the patch of earth behind the cottage. It's not much. A few rows of cabbage, some onions, a half-wild tangle of leeks and herbs if you're lucky. This is the peasant's garden, not a place of beauty, but survival. Everything here depends on the season. The sun, the frost, the patience of the soil. Too much rain and it floods. Too little, and it dies. And when winter comes, the ground hardens. Nothing grows, and the cellar must carry you through. So you learn to prepare, to pickle and salt, to dry apples on the rooftop, and tie onions into braided ropes to hang from the rafters. Because when the snow falls, you will eat what you saved, not what you crave. It's strange to think how limited the medieval diet really was. We imagine feasts and tables piled with food. But for most people, meals rotated through the same few ingredients. Barley, rye, peas, cabbage, beans, sometimes carrots. If the weather didn't ruin the crop. Wheat, that was for the rich. White bread was soft, refined, elegant. Peasants ate what was darker, denser, and harder to digest. Grinding grain was a task in itself. If you had access to a communal mill, you paid a fee, sometimes in flour. If not, you crushed it by hand between stones, hour after hour. Your arms aching, your back bowed. The result? Bread that was coarse, gritty, sometimes filled with fragments of the grinding stone itself. A mouthful of survival, not satisfaction. Still, they made do. Pottage, thick vegetable stew was the staple. A simmering blend of whatever was on hand. Sometimes watery, sometimes hearty, always repetitive. You'd eat it for lunch, eat it again for dinner, then reheat what remained the next morning. Maybe add a crust of bread, maybe not. Milk was rare for adults. Often turned to cheese as quickly as possible before it spoiled. Butter was a treasure. Eggs came and went depending on the season, and whether the chickens had survived the foxes. Meat? Still a dream. We'll get to that. For now, just imagine the quiet of a midday meal in the fields. A clay bowl of warm pottage held in rough hands. A spoon carved from wood. The sound of wind through the barley. And a silence shared by all because everyone is too hungry to speak. And somehow, even in that hunger, they gave thanks. To the earth. To the weather. To their labor. Because they knew how fragile it all was. One bad harvest could mean starvation. One cold spring and everything changes. So they planted. They prayed. They waited. And when the first green sprouted from the ground each spring, they didn't see it as a vegetable. They saw it as hope. Meat, the dream of every hungry stomach. The centerpiece of every imagined feast. But in the Middle Ages, meat was rare, precious, and sometimes dangerous. For most peasants, eating meat was not a daily event, not even weekly. It was for holy days, for weddings, for births, for funerals. A moment of joy wrapped in salt and smoke. You didn't just decide to roast a chicken. You waited. You hoped. And when the chance came, you used every single part. Not just the leg, not just the breast, but the feet, The neck, the heart, the liver, even the blood. You'd make black pudding from it. Mix it with oats and fat. Boil it into sausage. A humble kind of richness. Pigs were prized for this reason. One pig could feed a family for weeks if you knew how to preserve it. Every cut mattered. The fat was rendered for cooking. The skin was used for shoes. Even the bristles had value. But it had to be done right, because food safety wasn't really a thing. Meat spoiled quickly. Flies found it fast. And the line between still edible and lethal was thin and fuzzy. There were no expiration dates, only the smell test, and even that could lie to you. It wasn't uncommon for someone to fall ill after a shared meal. Food poisoning, botulism, worms, they crept in silently. When someone died, it was often blamed on bad luck or the wrath of saints, not yesterday's mutton stew. Of course, the nobles ate meat, plenty of it, venison from the king's forests, swan and peacock, roasted whole and served with gold-dusted sauces, or with apples in its mouth brought out on a silver platter. But hunting without permission was a crime, a serious one. If a peasant was caught poaching, even a rabbit or a bird, the punishment could be harsh. Fines, beatings, prison, sometimes worse. Still, hunger pushed people to risk it. Snares hidden in the woods, traps baited near streams, the hope of one fresh meal, just enough to make the danger worth it. Some turned to trapping squirrels or catching frogs. Others scavenged offal from market scraps. Every bit helped. Then there were fish. Fish were a kind of loophole, technically not meat, at least in the eyes of the church. So during fasting seasons, when meat, dairy, and eggs were banned, fish became the fallback. If you lived near water, you could catch your own. Eels in rivers, herring from the sea, trout. If you were lucky, monasteries raised fish in man-made ponds. Villages smoked what they could for winter. Fish was salty, bony, and often unpleasant. But it was food, and that mattered more than taste. Back in the cottage kitchen, a pot simmers over a low flame. Inside, maybe a scrap of bacon rind, or a bone, long since stripped, simmering for the memory of flavor. Even the smell is enough to bring the children running. They press close to the hearth, eyes wide, mouths watering. There's barely any meat in the meal. But it changes everything, because meat meant more than food. It meant strength, warmth, the feeling that, just for today, life wasn't about scraping by. It was about tasting something rich, savory, satisfying, even if it was gone in 3 bites. If meat was rare, bread was everything. It filled the gaps, warmed the hands, soaked up the last drops of broth in the bowl. But not all bread was equal, not even close. The rich had soft, white loaves, made from finely sifted wheat flour, baked in brick ovens tended by trained hands. Loaves you could tear open with ease, crusts that crackled gently beneath your fingers. The poor, they had something else entirely, rough, dark, dense, sometimes more stone than grain, because their flour wasn't pure wheat. It was barley, rye, or millet, whatever was cheapest, whatever would grow in weak soil, and sometimes not even food at all. There are records of bakers cutting their flour with powdered chalk, clay, ground up beans, even sawdust. Why? To stretch their profits, to sell more loaves with less grain, to fill more mouths without feeding them well. And when people complained, they were told to be grateful. Bread was bread. If it filled your stomach, it did its job. But eating that kind of bread took effort. It was heavy, hard to chew, and it often left grit between your teeth. Sometimes a cracked molar, sometimes worse. And still, bread was sacred. Every home baked it or bought it or traded for it. Children were raised on it. Fasts were broken with it. Deals were sealed over it. When bread ran out, fear crept in. So governments took notice. That's where the assize of bread came in. A law passed in 13th century England, meant to regulate the size and price of loaves. It set strict rules: how much a loaf should weigh, what it should cost, what it could be made of. Each village had a designated bread weight tied to grain prices. Too light, and the baker could be fined. Too expensive, and the bread could be seized. But enforcing it? That was another matter. There were no barcodes, no ingredient lists, just trust, and the occasional surprise inspection. When bakers were caught cheating, they were sometimes put in the pillory, public shaming, rotting vegetables thrown at their heads. Some were banned from selling again. Others disappeared quietly, but the practice continued, because hunger makes people easy to fool, and desperation doesn't ask too many questions. So bread remained what it was: a gamble, a daily ritual of hope and caution. And when bread couldn't be trusted, people turned to something else. Ale. Ale was more than a drink. It was hydration. It was calories. It was safety. Water, in many towns, was unsafe, contaminated by runoff, animals, or human waste, clouded with filth, alive with disease. But ale, boiled during brewing, fermented, mildly alcoholic, was cleaner. Even children drank it. Weak ale, called small beer, was served at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It didn't make you drunk, but it kept you alive. And like bread, ale had its cheaters too. Some brewsters added herbs to mask sourness. Others watered down their batches. A few skipped the boiling step entirely, leading to spoiled barrels and sick customers. There were women known as alewives, brewing in their homes, selling to neighbors, marking their doors with a long pole wrapped in greenery, the medieval version of a pub sign. People lined up. A cup of warm ale by the hearth, a hunk of hard bread in your hands. Not a feast, but a comfort, a little bit of control in an uncertain world, even in its roughest form. Bread meant stability. Ale meant community. Together, they turned a bare table into a meal. In medieval Europe, food wasn't just about hunger. It was about obedience, because the church didn't just shape your soul. It shaped your supper, too. There were rules, strict, detailed, unavoidable. More than half the days on the calendar were marked as fasting days. And fasting didn't mean not eating. It meant not eating meat, dairy, or eggs. No butter, no cheese, no lard, no milk in your pottage. For peasants who rarely had these things anyway, it might not seem like much. But for monasteries, for noble households, for townsfolk with a little more access to, fasting meant rethinking the entire menu. On Fridays, during Lent, before Easter, leading up to Christmas. All of it observed with careful mouths and quiet plates. And it wasn't optional. Skipping a fast day was a sin. Cooking meat on a holy day? Scandalous. Some people cheated, of course. Kept a little bacon tucked away. Whispered prayers while licking the fat from their fingers. But others took it seriously. They found workarounds. Fish was the loophole. And suddenly, rivers, lakes, and oceans became spiritual allies. Fish ponds were dug near monasteries. Freshwater eels became a staple. Salted herring was shipped inland by the barrel. Even beavers, yes, beavers were declared acceptable because they lived in water and had tails like fish. That's theology for you. And when fasting ended, the feast began. Feasting was not just allowed. It was expected. After weeks of sparse meals, a holy day or village festival would erupt into abundance. Roasted meats, spiced pies, candied fruits, cheese wheels split open with a knife the size of your forearm. Ale flowed freely. Children chased each other through muddy streets. Even the poorest were given a taste of celebration. Leftovers, bones, or broken bread, and for a few precious hours, the line between rich and poor blurred, but not for long, because the next day, the rules returned. The balance of fast and feast wasn't just about religion. It was a rhythm, a structure in a world of chaos. a way to explain hunger as holy, to make deprivation feel sacred. The church's influence went beyond diet. Monks kept herb gardens, recorded recipes, brewed ale, studied digestion. They believed food shaped the body and the soul. Too much wine made you lustful. Too much meat made you angry. Beans? Well, beans were a matter of debate. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins. So appetite had to be watched, measured, tamed. Even laughter at the table was discouraged. Meals were to be eaten with reverence, in silence if possible, because eating wasn't pleasure, it was purpose. And yet, within these rules, people found ways to live. They adapted. They flavored their fish with herbs. They made almond milk when cow's milk was forbidden. They created entire cuisines within the boundaries of belief. In a way, the church turned every meal into a meditation, every bite, a decision, every craving, a challenge. It may sound rigid, but it gave life a rhythm, and in that rhythm, people found meaning. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just food. It was status. It was identity. It was a silent announcement of who you were and where you stood. Because the table, no matter how humble or grand, was a mirror, and it reflected everything. In the grand halls of castles, meals were rituals of power. The Lord sat high above. At the raised table on the dais, a cloth spread beneath his feast. Not just any cloth, linen. Pure, white, and costly. His plates were pewter. His cups were silver. He didn't serve himself. He didn't touch the food until it was carved by someone else, announced by name, and placed before him. Down the hall, his guests ate by rank. Knights, clerics, favored officials. They ate closer to him. Servants and lesser folk, farther, at the bottom of the pecking order. You might be lucky to eat the scraps. In some houses, there were 2 kitchens, one for the Lord, one for everyone else. Even what you ate said something. The Lord had roast swan, seasoned with cloves and cinnamon. You had pottage. If the Lord had beef with wine sauce, you had barley bread, and maybe an onion. Forks were rare even among the rich. You ate with your hands, or used a dull knife, your own, brought from home. Plates? The poor didn't have them. They used trenchers, stale bread cut into slabs. The rich used trenchers as disposable dishes. They'd throw them away or donate them to beggars. The poor ate them, soaked with grease and sauce, grateful for the flavor. Meanwhile, back in the village, class still shaped the meal. A merchant's family might have cheese, smoked fish or apples stored in straw. A peasant's meal? The same cabbage stew, the same barley gruel. Day after day, children didn't have choices. They ate whatever was left, or went to bed hungry. Even at weddings, the divide remained. The wealthy threw feasts that lasted for days. Whole pigs roasted, ale flowing from barrels, musicians playing. The poor, they shared one table, a loaf of bread, a jug of weak ale, a single chicken cut 10 ways. Food was celebration, but only for some. And during famines, the distance between tables grew cruel. Nobles hoarded grain, merchants raised prices, and the hungry waited outside bakeries, hoping for crumbs. There were bread riots. People stormed granaries, tore down price signs, demanded fairness, but they were rarely heard, because hunger makes you quiet, and those in power preferred silence. The church preached patience. The nobles preached order, but bellies don't listen to sermons. Still, the people found ways to endure. They planted small gardens, traded eggs for bread, shared meals in silence, taught their children that dignity isn't measured in meat. They passed down recipes that used nothing, and somehow made it enough. A bit of barley, a sprig of thyme, a boiled root. These were the flavors of the poor. Simple, steady, honest. And though they had less, They wasted nothing. In time, these small meals became memories, then stories, then pride, because even when the table was bare, they gathered. Even when the feast was meager, they shared. And that is where true richness lived, not in what was eaten, but in who was fed. When we talk about food in the Middle Ages, we talk about hunger, hardship, scarcity, but we also talk about something else, resilience, because through every cold winter, every failed harvest, every long fast, people found a way to keep going. They didn't eat for pleasure, they ate for survival, but even in that, they found meaning. A pot of cabbage soup, stirred with care, a chunk of dark bread, shared between brothers, a cup of warm ale, passed from one tired hand to another. These weren't just meals, they were moments of human endurance. And when you've gone without, when you've counted every grain, scraped every bowl, you learn to honor food differently. You learn to stretch, to create, to make something from nothing. A stone hearth, a wooden spoon, a child's laugh as steam curls from a pot. That's what stayed with people. Not the roast goose, not the silver plates, but the stew that fed 5 on the last potato. The bread baked in silence, and broken in peace. The Middle Ages didn't offer much softness, but still mothers sang while cooking. Fathers bartered for flour. Neighbors shared what little they had. Because hunger may be cruel, but community is kind. And across time, these quiet acts of care, they linger. The recipes passed down without writing. The smell of onions in a hot pan. The feeling of holding a warm bowl. After a long cold day, these are the memories that survive. History often tells us about kings and battles, about conquests and collapses. But the story of food? That's the story of everyone else. The forgotten, the quiet, the tired, the strong. Their meals weren't glamorous, but they mattered, because in every scrap of bread, in every ladle of soup, was a decision to endure. And that is worth remembering. So tonight, as you rest your head, think of the flickering fire in a thatched cottage, the steam rising from a pot, the sound of a spoon scraping the bottom. One last time. Not much, but enough. You've scraped the bottom of the bowl. The fire is dim. The day is done. And somehow, you made it. Through hunger, through cold, through rules and rituals, fasts and feasts. You lived the rhythm of a world long gone. A world where bread was heavy with grit, and ale was safer than water. Where meals were quiet, hard-won, and every bite was a small act of survival. You saw what it meant to endure, not with swords or banners, but with cabbage stew, trenchers, and hope. These people didn't ask for much. And still, they gave what little they had. A shared bowl, a warm crust, a whispered laugh by candlelight. And maybe that's enough. So now as you lie in a soft bed, in a world of light switches, warm baths, and morning coffee waiting in your kitchen, let your body soften, let your breath slow, let your mind drift far from that smoky hearth, to something gentler. The pot is empty, the table is still, and you, dear listener, are home. Sleep well, time traveler. You've earned it.